Okay, so let's say you've done all your experiments, you have exciting results, you're ready to go ahead and write the paper, or you're writing the paper, but you need to decide before you do that, what are you going to do with this paper for publication? What is your target journal? Think about a realistic assessment of the work. What's its significance? Is it really practice changing, or is it really change the way we think about a disease? Is it novel? It can be very important to publish confirmatory data, but if it is confirmatory primarily of other people's work, you need to be honest about that, because it looks really stupid if you don't cite prior work. Like the viewers are stupid and they're not going to read. It doesn't work to just ignore it. Do you have definitive data? Does that mean do you have enough replicates? Do you have true statistical significance? If it's clinical, is it prospective? Is it randomized? All the things we like to see in clinical trials is obviously not always possible. But if it is prospective and randomized, it's more likely to be get into a journal that is more competitive. Is it descriptive versus mechanistic? Is it a complete story, or is it an MPU, as we call minimal publishable unit? We try to avoid MPUs, I think, in general, because they're very frustrating for readers. They're not really helpful for literature in general. And I think the fact that most journals and granting bodies and tenure committees now accept the concept of co-first authorship, it is therefore much more reasonable to put a whole story together when two postdocs have worked on two different components of the study, or even three in some cases, together in one coherent story in a higher impact journal, in a place that more people will read it, than it is to separate things off into these MPUs that are not going to end up being nearly as practice changing or changing the way we think about concepts. Thinking about how much time pressure you're under is very important. Many of you are going to have grant deadlines where you actually need the paper to be accepted. Saying in preparation or in revision just doesn't really make it. We can list hundreds of papers that are in preparation. Nobody really believes that in preparation for submission to Cell is really, meaningful. Think about your career timeline constraints. If you're not in a huge rush, it may be reasonable to try a journal that you're not at all sure it'll get into. If you're really going out and looking for a job in 6 months, you have to get it out quickly. Most journals do have statistics on their turnaround time on their websites, usually if they're good about turnaround time. Blood is fantastic about turnaround time, so if you need the article out quickly, submit to Blood. We also have a fast-track mechanism for really high-profile work that we want to get out quickly. And then think about, does your topic fit the substance and style of the journal? Who should be reading your paper? Blood is great because we have clinicians and basic scientists, and everybody should read Blood if they're interested in hematology. But, I'm astounded sometimes at the papers we do get sent to Blood, which, are things like studying a new way to measure glucose in the blood. Therefore, it must be hematology. Cardiology studies because the heart pumps the blood. Anyway, that's, so look at the table of contents, and if you can't imagine reading, the table of contents of the journal that you want to submit to, and you can't imagine your paper sitting there, no matter how high the impact factor is or how good the name sounds because it has nature in the title, it doesn't belong there if the content just doesn't fit, and you're going to waste time and you're going to waste a submission fee because the editor is probably just going to send it back without looking at it for more than 5 seconds, saying this is not within the scope of our journal. If you're really not sure whether it falls within the scope of the journal, it's very reasonable to send a pre-submission inquiry to the editor. Some journals have a formal pre-submission inquiry process on their website. Other ones, they always have the email for the editorial office or the editor-in-chief on the journal website. Just send an email. That email should be succinct, usually include the abstract, and a very brief paragraph on why it's important and why you think it belongs in the journal that you're asking about. Do not send 5 pages of explanation because they won't read it. And again, when you're thinking about where to submit, impact factor is not the only factor. It's unfortunately become a greater and greater focus around the world as science becomes really a global enterprise, and it's harder and harder to have in maybe a small institution in a developing country a tenure committee or an institutional review board or study sections where there's enough expertise that people are really reading the papers and deciding on their worth. Instead, they use a simple number, which is very, very easy to manipulate. So I'll tell you actually what it is and how it's calculated. An impact factor for 2011 would be the number of times papers that were published in 2009 and 2010 in the journal were cited in 2011. So it's looking 2 years back, but only 1 year of citations. And the denominator is the total number of citable articles published in 2009 and 2010. And what are citable articles? Well, that's how you can manipulate this, among other things. They have to have abstracts. They have to, primary research papers are certainly citable, review articles are citable, but generally not letters to the editor. But some journals have a lot of primary reports in letters to the editor with no abstract. They're not counted in the denominator, but they are often cited. So that's a really good thing for your journal's impact factor. Short commentaries, for instance, Inside Bloods in our journal are not, are not citable. I mean, are not considered citable and are not in the denominator. So how do you manipulate impact factors? Well, you don't publish any primary research articles. You just publish reviews because reviews are very highly cited. You only publish your journal in the first half of a calendar year because, as I told you, the impact factor of 2011, the papers that were published in the second half of 2010 haven't been cited yet. They haven't been out there long enough. So you really want to front load all your stuff at the beginning of the year, but that's not very useful for an author whose paper was accepted in October and it's held by a journal until January. Don't publish any negative studies, don't publish articles on rare diseases, publish short commentaries and letters that have primary data that are going to get cited, and publish really novel stuff, even if it's wrong. Now, the first genome sequence is obviously fantastically citable and has been wonderful for the impact factor of those journals. Drug company-sponsored clinical trials often recite their own work repeatedly, no matter what, even if it's not relevant, so that, that can be useful for the journal where they published it. Some journals actually send out reviews saying, please cite these other articles from our journal. Blood never does that. I don't think it's ethical, but it's one way to get your impact factor up. And sometimes making up really hot stuff that's a complete fabrication. For instance, the Huang studies from Korea where the stem cell lines were faked was cited at least 417 times in 2007 after the work was retracted and after it had been all over, the New York Times and CNN and everything else that it was completely fabricated. If you keep citing articles even after they're retracted, they still count for the journal's impact factor. So that's sort of interesting.